Well, welcome back everyone. Hope you had a lovely lunch. Wasn't that food delicious?
Fantastic.
Thank you to the Jam Company. Amazing food. We always love supporting that company and eating their delicious things. Oh, thank you, Naomi. So it's great to see some new faces in the room online this afternoon and also here. We've had a fantastic morning, wouldn't you agree? Yes. I want to really thank Bridie and Naomi for leading that so generatively together. Like, you really modelled for us a way forward. So thank you so much. It was really, really great. This afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the land where we live and work. And we meet here today on the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. And we pay our respects to their cultures, their ancestors and their elders, past and present. We recognise the continuing trauma caused by losses of children, language, law and land, and the impact that this continues to have on psychological, physical and spiritual well-being. We recognise that since time immemorial, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have nurtured communities of belonging and thriving, and we work in solidarity towards a future of healing and justice. To summarise this morning, I have two just very quick reflections, and one is that it really was an all-in experience. We brought our minds in, but then we had our bodies and our creativity and our emotions all stirred up and brought into the mix, which is really powerful. And that shouldn't be seen as a problem. That should be seen as a rich way of being together. So thank you to our facilitators this morning for reminding us that we're not just heads on bodies. We are the whole thing. We're all in. We also learnt through that, I think, to unlearn some dominant research principles that I know myself as a non-Indigenous researcher, have fully embraced to my own detriment, and I'm learning to undo that. I found this morning too to be also very liberating, that in fact the principles we're learning about, and the more we learn about them, we can actually liberate ourselves and become free of unproductive ways of doing research. I'd like us to just be reminded as well this afternoon as we move forward into our next session of the 7 R's of healing that we, Ali, have offered us, just to remind us of those, and those of us who were here this morning did some really great work thinking about what they mean for us. Respect, rights, responsibility, reciprocity, relatedness, resilience and resonance. So let's keep those close in mind as we move through the next part of the session. I'm going to hand over now to Shiv, who's online, Professor Shiva Shankar Nagaraj. He's the head of Genomics and Computational Biology Lab at Griffith. And again, we're all in. We've got people represented from all across the university, which is terrific for our first event. So Shiv, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be sharing this session with Jen. As you see in the screen, I work in the area of Indigenous health, and my own training has been in technology, genomics, and how we could really leverage on a lot of modern medicine developments that are going on to support Indigenous communities across the country and also internationally. So I really welcome all of you to the First Futures Series workshop, and my pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon from University of Melbourne, Dr. Wendy Hermeston and Amali Andrews, who will share their national perspectives on ethical research, Indigenous data sovereignty, and evolving expectations around the First Nations-led research practice. Very briefly, Wendy is a Viraj Duri Scholar and a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, whose work focuses on self-determination, ethical research practice, and Indigenous data sovereignty. Her research and advocacy have also contributed nationally to conversations around Aboriginal child well-being, community-led governance, and culturally grounded approaches to policy and research reform. On the other hand, Amali Andrews is a Palawa woman working with University of Melbourne. She is in a research support role at the Alive National Center for Mental Health Research Translation, where she contributes to a range of projects across diverse areas. Her work contributes to the strengthening of First Nations-led research capacity and supporting culturally informed approaches across Indigenous health and research systems. So without further ado, I would like to introduce them, and they can perhaps start their presentation.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Shiv. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully that works. Let's see. Okay. Perfect. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I wanted to start by also acknowledging traditional owners of country that we're on today. Wendy and I are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. But I'd also like to acknowledge country that everyone is on today and recognise the deep connection to land, seas, waterways, skies and community, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. So what I'm going to do for my part of this presentation is unpack what we actually mean when we're talking about ethical principles for culturally safe research. And I'm going to be touching on briefly NHMRC's 6 core principles, but mainly I'll be talking about AIATSIS's Code of Ethics as the main focus for my presentation. And there'll also be a reference table at the end with various frameworks and other key resources as well with their links. But before I get into the frameworks themselves, I wanted to say that speaking in a researcher capacity, it's really important to know which ethical guidelines apply to our work. And although the frameworks I'm going to be speaking about are important reference points, they're not completely exhaustive. And depending on where you're working and which community you're working in, there may be regional, local and community-specific ethics requirements that sit alongside or even above national frameworks, and that some communities have their own ethics processes and some regions have specific governance structures that must be engaged with. And it's actually not the community's responsibility to tell you what applies. It's yours as a researcher to find out before the research begins. And that accountability is really what is part of being and what it means to be an ethical researcher. Alrighty. Slides work. Beautiful. So cultural safety and ethical research are terms that get used a lot in our field, and sometimes interchangeably and sometimes quite loosely. And I don't think we're always really sitting with what they're actually asking of us in practice. Cultural safety is shifting the focus away from the researcher's intentions and towards the experience of community. And the question really is whether the people that you're researching with are feeling safe, and that's culturally, relationally, and also in terms of power balances as well. And that's a tension that's in this space that actually doesn't get talked about enough. You know, we have good frameworks and we have language, and in most ethics applications you'll find that language. It's ticked and documented and approved, but the gap between these principles on paper and actually what is happening in practice is very significant. So we're speaking about what that gap actually looks like. In communities, it looks like communities being brought in after the research question has been developed, when the methodology has already been designed and the funding's already been secured. It looks like an Aboriginal reference group that maybe meets twice across a 3-year project, or findings being published before communities have seen them. It might look like data sitting in a university repository that the community who generated that data can't actually access. And that's the tension, because understanding the principles actually isn't the hard part. What the hard part is asking honestly, at what point do we actually bring community in, whether they're shaping the questions or are they just validating our answers as researchers? Are they partners across the full life cycle of research, or are they just being engaged at the beginning for consent, at the end for feedback? So with that in mind, move on to the brief, overview of NHMRC. Because its 6 core values of spirit and integrity, cultural continuity, equity, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility run as a thread through everything that follows. And what is particularly important about the NHMRC framework is its recognition that ethical research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is relational and non-linear, and that the research journey doesn't just move in a straight line. That communities may need to return to earlier stages at any point, and that trust needs to be actively maintained throughout the entire research process. And that the relational foundation, is exactly what the AIATSIS Code of Ethics builds on and deepens as well. Yes, and also everything that I'm mentioning today will be in the last slide with all of our links and resources. Okay, so the AIATSIS Code of Ethics gives us 4 principles. We have Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous leadership, impact and value, and sustainability and accountability. But what I really want to draw your attention to is that circle in the middle, which is the principle of integrity. And integrity isn't just one principle that's sitting amongst others in this framework, but it's actually the core that's holding everything together. And every principle, responsibility, and research decision flows from and is returning to it. And I think it's worth sitting with because it means that ethical research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities isn't a primarily procedural question, but it's a question of character sometimes, and whether we're actually acting with honesty and honour and with genuine respect for the communities that we are working with at every single stage of the research. So we have the first principle here, which is Indigenous self-determination. And the responsibilities attached to self-determination are recognition and respect, engagement and collaboration, informed consent, and cultural capability and learning. And what this looks like in practice is communities having a genuine say in what research about them looks like, what questions are worth asking, what methods make sense, and what a meaningful outcome actually is. And here it means asking whose framework are we using, and did the community have a hand in shaping it? If the research question was set before community was involved, self-determination really has already been compromised, and acting with integrity means actually being honest about that as researchers. Next, we have Indigenous leadership, and the responsibilities attached to this principle are Indigenous-led research, Indigenous perspectives and participation, and Indigenous knowledge and data. And what this looks like in practice is Indigenous people holding genuine decision-making authority across the full lifespan of research, from the conception of the idea all the way through to when the findings are communicated and used. And again, not just being in a reference group that meets twice, or even a co-investigator whose name is on the grant, but actually whose input really shapes quite little. But it means real leadership that's visible in both the why and the how of the research. And acting with integrity here is what really it means asking honestly. Are Indigenous people genuinely driving this research, or is leadership being performed rather than practiced? Moving on to impact and value, the responsibilities here are benefit and reciprocity, and impact and risk. What this looks like in practice is being able to answer clearly and honestly before the research begins. Will this community be able to do differently because this research has happened? Not what will we publish as researchers or present at a conference, but what tangible benefit will be flowing back to the people who made the research possible. Here it means that reciprocity is built into the project design from day one and not added at the end because there's a bit of budget left over, but it means going back to community with findings in a form that they can actually use and is accessible to them. A community feedback session, plain language statement, genuine conversation about what the results mean and explaining that to community, and what the community would like to do with those. And the AIATSIS Code also notes that for consent to be genuinely informed, there must be mutual understanding of both benefits and risk. And in research, particularly where participation might be resurfacing some trauma or expose sensitive community information, the risk side of that equation really needs to be taken seriously, and not just minimised in the ethics application. And then finally, we have sustainability and accountability. And the responsibilities for this are Indigenous lands and waters, ongoing Indigenous governance and reporting and compliance. And this in practice looks like research that doesn't just end when the project period does. So it means communities retaining governance over their data and their knowledge long after the formal research has actually ended. It means data sovereignty, so written into the research agreement at the start, not just negotiated after the fact when a university repository perhaps has already absorbed everything. And it means staying in relationship throughout the project. So checking in, asking what came of the research, what it meant, what the community would like to do differently. And that, again, is throughout the entire research, not just at the end. and reporting back to the people who trusted you with their knowledge and their time. And the gap between principles on paper and principles in practice is really quite significant. And being able to close this starts with us taking responsibility as researchers for knowing and taking accountability for finding out what ethical obligations apply to our work and in the specific places and spaces and within the specific communities that we're actually engaging with. Now, moving on to the second part of what I'll be speaking about today. I'll be moving on to some real life examples of these principles and frameworks kind of being translated onto on-ground research projects and papers. And these are going to be drawn from work that my colleague at Alive, Oscar Martin, has put together and was presented earlier this year at the Alive 2026 Symposium. He isn't able to be here today, but he has generously allowed me to present on his behalf. And I think these words really speak powerfully to everything that we've just been talking about. So before I read out some excellent quotes that Oscar has pulled out, it's really important to ask ourselves two questions. How do we embed and practice culturally safe principles and frameworks within research? And why does this matter? And I think for now, we're just going to have a bit of a ponder about this. And the second part, before Wendy's presentation, we're going to be having a little bit of an interactive discussion. So just some thoughts to think about for later in your groups. But Oscar has been conducting reviews of a plethora of research papers that have had a focus on Indigenous-led or Indigenous-focused papers and how they embed and utilise culturally safe principles and frameworks. And the papers have covered a wide time frame, so from the late 2000s to last year, so 2025, where they've directly involved Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in leading the research, or at least acknowledge the positionality of the researchers throughout their projects. So we've got two quotes. Okay, beautiful. So this first quote is from the paper, "If you don't speak from the heart, the young mob aren't going to listen at all." And this paper is how to get mob to more frequently access mental health services that's relevant and culturally secure. And it focuses on a deep and sustained relationship between elders, young people and service staff. And research was centred on this throughout the whole project and sought to continue this beyond the research. And elders were involved as co-researchers on the project, and it embedded a Noongar worldview into the research framework. Just give it a minute to read that quote up there. And then the second paper. This snippet is from a paper titled "You Didn't Just Consult Community, You Involved Us, Transformation of a Top-Down Aboriginal Mental Health Project into a Bottom-Up Community-Driven Process." And this paper sought to design and evaluate a culturally appropriate training program in an e-mental health strategies. So, for example, use of apps and online therapy programs. And this would enhance the skills of service providers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it focused on community-driven research and acknowledged straight away that there are constant tick and flick processes in research that notes community consultation and engagement, but isn't actually involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities within the process of the research, or again, it's not consistent throughout. And these papers, I hope, bring a useful insight in how we can actively embed culturally safe research principles and frameworks into our research. One thing to note is that what I just presented shouldn't necessarily be taken as sacrosanct on how we practice these principles and frameworks. All different projects and papers will be working with different communities and peoples who have a variety of needs and issues that we'll be working with as such. And then this will change in the way we approach our projects and research, and what guides us all into different areas of research with Aboriginal communities and peoples is how we are involving, centering and benefiting Aboriginal communities and people, and what that's going to look like actually on the ground. And this will be something that we're going to keep in mind as we now move on to our interactive discussion. Wendy's going to introduce that.
Yeah, let's roll.
Roll over.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea.
Oops. Sorry. Hello, everyone. My name's Wendy Hermeston. I'm Wiradjuri from New South Wales, but living and working on Wurundjeri country here in the Kulin Nation that Amali's already acknowledged, and I'd just like to pay my respects as well to elders and past, present, and future, and also just acknowledge. And you're quite welcome to put in the chat if you want to do that, where you're all coming from, if you haven't already done that, and especially recognising people with lived experience of removal, whatever end of that they might be on in this week, where we've had Sorry Day, and that's my background of being removed and separated from my own family and raised in a white adoptive family. So just to acknowledge that in this week, it's a solemn week for us all. So so just to pick up, and thank you, Amali, for running through that, because it's a lot, and it's a lot of dense information to get through, and so thank you for doing that for Oscar's as well, his contribution. And I'm just, what I kind of heard from, I heard this morning went really well, and I was just listening in to how that discussion went this morning. And so everything that Amali's just been talking about, you've probably all been working through in a different way this morning. And by the sounds of it coming from, you're sharing all that information that we have to take on board as researchers. But I get a sense of what you were talking about this morning was a bit around the coming from the heart and really confronting your own practices and how you've been undertaking research. And we had a little chat this morning and just talked about how in some ways, if you're in the room, we're probably preaching to the converted to a lot of people, and who are doing your best to try and find ways of conducting research that actually really sit comfortably with you and your values, and as people first, and researchers second. So and sometimes we get that right, sometimes we get it wrong, and that goes for mob as well. I guess the difference is we have to answer to our community is the difference, and that's something that Jen can probably speak to in her session as well, especially being in a smaller community where you live and work in your community. And if you take a misstep, you hear about it, all right. So keeping that in mind for people in Jen's situation and for your Aboriginal or your Torres Strait Islander colleagues as well, that if you are conducting research with mob in your team, keeping in mind that mob need to go home and answer to community first, and that's usually who we prioritise, whereas other people kind of tend to prioritise other things.
Sorry to interrupt, Wendy.
Yeah.
Are you able to please move a little bit so that they can see your face? So there is a comment.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. If you can,
Is that better?
You.
As long as you can.
Slightly more, if that's possible. Yeah. Towards the center.
Wait. My dog
is. We can see both of you now. Thanks.
My dog is in a dog bed right behind our chairs, so I'm being careful where I'm moving. And he's asleep, so I don't want to make. Anyway, so I'm just going to ask you to think about those local examples. So the discussions this morning, that was a long-winded way of saying the discussion this morning and everything Amali just shared might have prompted some thoughts in practices you've been involved with where you actually have been kind of proud, or where it's made you rethink your research practice, whether that's in a positive way and improving things that need to be improved because you've seen things that weren't so good, or whether you've seen good examples and aspired to do those. So just thinking about those local examples of good practice and bad practice that have made you rethink your practice. We're going to pop you in a little short, I think we'll probably have about 8 minutes maximum. Would that be right, Shiv, to just have a bit of a yarn with 2 or 3 people in the online groups, and if you could turn to the person next to you in the room and just have a yarn with them. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining that small group. We can if anybody felt comfortable to share to the broader group, whether that's in the big room, we've only got a few minutes because we don't want to cut too much into children's grounds time. So yeah, just if there's anything that you wanted to share about practices that you've seen that made you rethink the way you do research ethically and.
Yeah, sure. I'll have a quick two-on if I was worth my CST. I guess the ethics about autoethnographical way is what am I doing, but also what am I projecting? You know, are my privileges part of my expectations? And my reflection on that, what is the heart doing as a self-awareness versus what is my emotional projection doing? In other words, what is my head saying that it's not my heart? So if I can catch myself in that situation, that gives me a chance to really consider my own boundaries or lack of. Full stop.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah. Oh, sorry, we've got things popping up on our screen. Yeah, I think that is, and that does, I think probably by the sounds of things, links a bit back to the discussion that happened in person in the room this morning. Naomi, want to chime in there? Or not?
Sorry, I'm just running around the room.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so just giving out the handheld mics in case anyone wants to talk here. But yeah, definitely, and Bridie's here, but other people in the room here may want to reflect on that rather than Bridie and I.
Don't be shy, it's a safe space to say anything you want.
Can we drop people in? Andreas, I don't think you were talking about your non-hierarchical.
Yeah. Andreas has been voluntold.
Thank you. What we discussed in our group was around establishing a non-hierarchical partnership is sometimes really challenging because you come into a community, they see you as the outside expert, the one that is trained academically, and they put themselves immediately in an inferior position. So how do you as a researcher dismantle that idea of you being the expert and them being the ones that actually have a deficit in knowledge or anything? Really acknowledging immediately their local knowledge, their superior knowledge, and having that humility as an outsider to get in there and say, I'm a learner, I'm not, even if I'm a professor, I'm learning from you. And I think that is hard work and kind of overcoming that automatic hierarchical positioning in a research space, I think is really challenging.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I didn't catch your name at the beginning. I'm sorry about that, but I think that's a really Andreas. Yeah, thank you, Andreas. And I think that's something that Jen may end up speaking to, that you might witness quite a lot in your local context there. So I might leave that for you to comment on in your, I think it might link to what you'll be speaking to, Jen, somehow. So, but it's interesting because what we've seen in terms of not so great practice is the actual opposite kind of view or attitude quite often of people coming into community perhaps with a sense that they are the experts. So that's, you're walking into a context where community might be used to people coming and imposing ideas and imposing that sense of being the experts above and beyond community knowledge, when community are actually the experts at what's going on in their own community. So, yeah, I'll leave that to Jen to speak to, but we probably need to move on. I'm just aware of the time, though. I was just going to wrap up by speaking to the last couple of slides that link back to, unless there's anything burning that anybody wanted to add in the room or online. And you're also welcome to pop it in the chat too. So if there's nothing burning that anybody wanted to share, I'm just aware of the last slides, Naomi, and how are we going for time? Are we cutting too much into Jen's slides?
Just think this is such a feat. We're juggling places, people. Here we go. Okay.
All right. Is that, you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Beautiful.
Maybe just kick it into present mode, Amali.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just going to link back quickly. Originally, we went more into the NHMRC 6 core values. So I'm just going to share just bringing those alongside what came from earlier discussions that we had in Alive as a centre, where we very much centre the lived experience of people with mental health in our research, that kind of guides the work that we do here. And so the principles that community kind of articulated from themselves about what ethical research actually feels like from the ground up. And I think what kind of strikes me is how they kind of precisely map to those 6 core values. So just give an example of how they kind of work in practice, those principles that were shared at the beginning. And again, there's a link at the end. So just for example, I won't go through them all because of the time, but just so it's about how they kind of feel in practice. So, for example, the spirit and integrity side of things. The NHMRC talks about connection across past, present, future, and honourable behaviour. And what we have a community reference group who guides our work, an Aboriginal community reference group here at Alive, our national centre. And for them, that what it actually means is thinking differently or deeply about what and why before you actually begin, and being completely honest, and don't make promises you can't keep. That's the same principle, but it lands differently when it kind of comes from community. Or on cultural continuity, so that's protecting cultures, languages and identity. And our CRG, our community reference group, said culture is in everything. Doing and knowing and being are interconnected, and that's not the Western model where you need to know before you can do. And they said stories are getting lost, and that's not abstract, that's urgent. And I'll just jump to reciprocity. So they just put it plainly, no taking, give something with us. It's people's time and knowledge. And just in terms of keeping things kind of safe, which is the next one, how it all kind of translates into the research journey. And what we see consistently, community members often only encounter researchers at data collection. So maybe at the start, that's when they're being asked for a letter of support, but rarely at analysis and rarely at outputs, and barely ever after the report is filed. So these are kind of 4 questions that we, I guess, ask you to ask yourselves as researchers. If you can just sit with those. So did the research idea actually come from conversations with MOB, with Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people, or was the idea brought to them as the expert? So sit with people, give time, and make sure you're listening. So second, are you going back not just to collect and extract, but to share what you're learning at every stage? And the third question, who actually leads and who builds capacity? Are the opportunities you take for granted as a researcher, the track record, the publications, the career development, are those embedded for community too? So colonial load, which is something you might have touched on this morning, let us know if not, is the weight of being asked to participate in systems that were never built for you. And the fourth question, how does community want their story shared back? A poem? Is it an artwork, a community meeting, maybe a video? Ask at the start and ask that question genuinely. So each of those maps back to those 6 core NHMRC values, and the links are at our last slide. I'll hand over now just to Jen Loraines. Jen, I'm not sure if Veronica is with you, and Veronica Doolan from Children's Ground in Murwillumbah. And we'd just like to thank you for listening today. We may get time for discussion at the end, I think, Naomi. And Shiv. So, yeah, I'd just like to hand over now to Jen Loraines.
Thank you very much.